glad you came out in the weather that's a little bit threatening, but I think it's going to hold off for us. Again, my name is Maggie Mosteller-Timbes, and welcome to the second in this year's series of presentations on the history of Fairhope, sponsored by the Fairhope Single Tax Corporation. I'm extremely proud to introduce our presenter tonight. She's just flown in from her home in Kingston, New York, where she lives near her daughter and two grandsons, and continues to be active in the arts and theater, community theater. Not only is our presenter tonight a knowledgeable Fairhope historian, she's also a published author and a gifted raconteur. So you're going to really enjoy hearing her perspective on the history of Fairhope 100 years ago. Born in Mobile, raised in Fairhope, Mary Lois Timbes-Adshead graduated from the Marietta Johnson School of Organic Education, where over the years she has served on the school's board of directors. She is also formerly a director of the Marietta Johnson Museum. Mary Lois left Fairhope in 1960 and, in her words, was hell-bent on becoming an actress. She went to New York City, where she studied acting under Peggy Fury and Lee Strasberg. And while seeking acting jobs, she supported herself in the fields of journalism and public relations. After she married DuPont advertising executive Jim Adshead, Mary Lois spent 6 years in Geneva, Switzerland, where she founded an American theater company. In 1988, Mary Lois returned to Fairhope, where she founded another theater company, an equity theater company, which she called Jubilee Fish. I had the privilege of seeing many of the plays that Mary Lois staged in the loft at Lakewood Country Club, and where she brought in equity actors from New York City. Never in my wildest dreams would I have thought that I would end up being the bride of one of those equity actors, her brother, Graham Timbes. And so it is with great pleasure that I introduce to you my sister-in-law, Mary Lois Timbes-Adshead.
Thank you, Maggie. Ooh, she's taller than I am. It's wonderful to see so many Fairhope fans here. And I will say that's a very gracious introduction, but probably the best achievement I ever had in Fairhope was recommending Maggie for the job of director of the Marietta Johnson Museum. She's the big attraction for it, and she does a wonderful job. But I'm going to take you all on a trip back to Fairhope 100 years ago. Most of these pictures are around the year of 1916. It might not be exact all the time. This you'll probably recognize, and you probably don't know exactly where it is, but I'm told by some of the people who remember or have seen the picture before that it's on Section Street. It's directly across from, not directly, but kind of cat-a-corner across from where Page and Pallet is today. Fairhope looked very different 100 years ago. I guess every place did. That was the main general store in the center of town, also known as the center of the universe, the corner of Section Street and Fairhope Avenue, and there was a water tower in the center of the street. This was on the bluff, and I'm not sure who that man lost in the pines is, but I think it's a beautiful picture.
That's probably no park, actually.
Really? Well, it could be. I thought it was the bluff part.
The perspective makes it look more like no park.
Well, you may be right. We're gonna have people that contribute, and if you can help me out with some of these pictures, you're welcome to do it, because I just picked them because they're interesting pictures. There was always the bay. In 1916, there were swimmers on the pier, there were dance pavilions, and the light went out. And there was a casino which served the community until the 1960s. Well, let's go look at those people taking a swim, if you like them. I thought that's a sweet picture. I just found that one just the other day. There was steamers that plied the bay back and forth, plied their routes from the docks in Mobile through Daphne, Montrose, Fairhope, and Point Clear. The boats left from Fairhope at 7 in the morning, and they served a breakfast, and they were the only means of transportation out of Fairhope. There weren't roads like we have today, then there wasn't a causeway for sure. People in Fairhope grew their own vegetables, and they kept livestock, they kept chickens and goats and so on. And for the most part, they were subsistence farmers, and they took care of themselves. Mr. Bollanzi had quite a lettuce farm. Mr. Bollanzi was really one of Fairhope's prime citizens in the early days. He was one of the 2 men sent from Iowa to scout for a perfect location for a utopian community. And the 2 of them, he and Mr. Mann, found this spot and recommended it. And he was responsible for setting up the many parks and park areas that Fairhope enjoys today, including Knoll Park. From early days, Fairhope citizens treasured that beach area. This is an early rustic bridge down about where the duck park is today. I love this shot. This is the top of the hill called Wharf Hill, and you're looking down Mobile Avenue. There was a rather rickety-looking bridge across it, but I'm sure it was sturdy because I never heard of anybody falling down. But that's just a very beautiful shot of the raw land that Fairhope was in those days. This is early Fairhope Avenue, and that's another view of that water tower. If you walk down Fairhope Avenue in 1916, you might be greeted by any one of a number of people who have since become iconic in the town. This is a very early shot of the corner of Fairhope Avenue and Section Street with the water tower in the center. A little later, an aerial view of the same intersection. Somebody said, how could you get an aerial view before they had airplanes? The fact is that was probably taken from the water tower. There are a number of pictures like that from a high height, and that's about where that was, so I assume that was it. And you might, as you're walking down Fairhope, have run into this man, E.B. Gaston, founder of the Colony. He had a large family, and at that point he was actively editing the Fairhope Courier, which was a publicity outlet for his theory of single tax and his utopian vision. He used the pages of the Courier to persuade people to move to Fairhope. His wife, Clara, she came not only with Mr. Gaston, but her family, the Mershons, who ran the local general store for years. Her brother, Nathaniel, was in charge of the pharmacy. Am I right? Was he her brother? Does anybody know? Nathaniel, he was on the city council, and we see pictures of him. We're going to see him later. But all I know is he was a Mershon, and generations later, there was a doctor in town, a psychiatrist, Dr. Mershon. In the meantime, the Gaston family, a very serious photograph, but don't forget, people didn't really smile in photographs in those days, but they were a wonderful family and very well respected. Mr. Gaston himself was known as somebody who just was so devoted to making Fairhope a success. He went out every morning and milked his own cow, and on his walks he would see if anybody needed anything, and he would chip in and do it. Also in the family is this picture, identified only as Clara's boy. And I just thought it was this very sweet picture. And I think it might be the child that Marie Howland described. She was writing in her letters to people about her wonderful idyllic life in Fairhope. And she said she loved gardening, and she had beautiful gardens, and she just loved all the little beautiful children who came and played in the garden. One she particularly called the cherub. And I asked one of the older ladies who that cherub would have been, and they said Clara Gaston. So I'm thinking this might be Clara Gaston. I don't know for sure. All I know is it's Clara's boy. Later I thought it looks kind of like David Campbell. He could be Clara Campbell's boy, but we'll never know. I'm going to leave it at he's the cherub. This Gaston demonstrates how much the people of Fairhope loved horses. And they needed horses. You know, horses were just the regular thing. This is Arthur F. Gaston. I particularly included him because people may not know his name was Arthur Fairhope Gaston. This is Marie Howland. We don't have many pictures of her, and this is a very nice one. She donated all of her books to create a public library for the town of Fairhope. It is said that this might have been the first public library, lending library, in the state of Alabama. It definitely was operating before there was a public library, excuse me, in Mobile. So we're very proud of that, and she was a very proud citizen of the town. She, let me see, I have a quote here from her. When she arrived in Fairhope in 1899, just 4 years after its founding, she wrote a friend, "You may say this life is idyllic. I cannot find a better word." She was a prominent citizen of the colony until her death in 1921. That's the first Fairhope library. Rather primitive, but that it was, books were that important to the early colonists that they really cherished having that. I'd like to interject at this point a description of Fairhope in those days from a novel that I wrote about Fairhope. This is from That Was Tomorrow. And I've tried to capture that feeling of what it was like just to walk down the street and see it for the first time. Amelia's first impression of Fairhope was that she was in the middle of one large citrus grove with a few chickens and goats running about. The Satsuma orange had been developed to be frost resistant for the occasional freezes and hardy enough to withstand Fairhope's high summer temperatures as well. It was a delicious and popular fruit, easy to peel and section, and just as tasty but less juicy than an orange. Soon after its introduction in Fairhope, the Satsuma was being planted all over town, in large yards and small, anywhere there might possibly be room for a small tree. Satsuma trees had the advantage of not growing to too great a height, having the appearance of a large bushy shrub. In the spring, she would learn, their blossoms exuded a heady, sweet fragrance. But now in early June, the bushes were heavy with the golden orange fruit. Every square foot of land that would support a tree had a plant on it. Children who explored freely through the town often pulled satsumas off the trees, which were so laden that the owners were not likely to notice one or two fruits missing. It was a common sight to see a youngster peeling and eating a satsuma, spitting the seeds anywhere he liked. There were oaks, some of them large, draped with Spanish moss that resembled nothing as much as gray ragged scarves hanging from their huge limbs. They added a grace to the heavy trees, as if a fashion designer had decided to drape a dowager with a complement of chiffon handkerchiefs. The founders had bought the original tract of land for their utopia in the late 1800s, at which time it had been lumbered out until the land was bare and parched. Early settlers had established a park on an old Indian mound property just above the Bay Hill, where they planted dogwood and azaleas and named it Knoll Park. arranging through the colony mandates that Fairhope would maintain this and the whole beachfront as public parkland in perpetuity. They had a clear idea of what utopia should look like, and they adhered to the principle of beauty as well as economic purpose in planning all aspects of the town. Compacted dirt paths provided sidewalks for the unpaved streets. The main street, Fairhope Avenue, boasted a millinery shop, a general store, a harness and carriage shop, and several cafes. Amelia walked through town seeing few pedestrians like herself, but those she passed smiled and greeted her. Children played freely on the paths and roads, and some were climbing in the trees, hanging upside down like monkeys. The train track ran down the center of Fairhope Avenue for the railway car that brought people up and down the hill to and from the steamer to Fairhope. Houses nestled in tree-lined lanes, unassuming bungalows next to wooden two-story homes with steep roofs, such as one would find in a northern climate, designed to shed heavy winter snows. The locals called the bigger new houses Fairhope's castles. But as Amelia walked, she couldn't avoid comparing the landscape to that which she was more familiar with. Next to the ornate Victorian architecture she knew, Fairhope's homes were very plain indeed.
And Lois might also point out that the current location here, the library, I believe, was the location of the Satsuma exchange when that business was a very large business in Fairhope prior to the 1924 freeze.
There were orchards all over town too. So
Substantial orchards, and that the Satsuma exchange was a big shed where the fruit was graded and packed and shipped out.
and it was right about this spot.
Right about this spot. It's a little bit east of here, but right about here.
Thank you. That's Bill Dyson, and he knows a lot about these details. Glad to have it. Yeah, he's heard the stories for years. You may have noticed a lot of these pictures have a little writing on the side, Stewart the Picture Man. This is a picture of Stewart the Picture Man, who was a professional photographer who really chronicled all of Fairhope's history in that day. We're very grateful, very lucky to have had him working as he did when he did. Here's a picture of him developing photographs in the creek, it looks like. I think it might have been staged. I don't know if he really developed his photographs this way. But there really aren't many pictures of him, but he was a very important citizen of Fairhope. Here's an interesting man, William Call. Again, he was a horseman, and one of his gigs was that he staged horseback rides for visitors. Cars only give you a glimpse. Hiking, you have to watch your step. The best way to see Fairhope and its environs is from the saddle. Gentle horses and new equipment. Instruction in equitation. Trail parties personally conducted. So he gives his address, which is the Pine Quat Shop. The Pine Quat Shop was the millinery shop we mentioned before that his wife ran, but he also obviously ran several other little businesses on the side through that. This is Dr. Greene, and that's one of the biggest big trees in the area, and that's about all I know about that. But Dr. Greene was the first mayor of Fairhope, and you will see him in a lot of old pictures when you're looking through the library, the Fairhope Museum or the Marietta Johnson Museum. He's the one with the beard. This picture is Mr. Bollanzi's house. And this house is on the corner of Magnolia and Bayview. And I was under the impression that it was gone long ago, and I drove past yesterday and thought, well, it's still there. It's tucked away in the trees and it's painted white. It's lost its embellishments, and it doesn't have the same Midwestern look that this has. It sort of looks like just a house, but this is a very special picture to me. And partly because it was Mr. Bollanzi, and he was one of the important citizens of town. These two houses were the original houses of Mr. Gaston and the Mershons. I don't know where they were. Do you, Phil?
Not immediately.
It could have been, well, I'll tell you, I think these were your dad's pictures. I think I got them from his book or somewhere. But anyway, all it says is the homes of Mershon and Gaston. And we know the Mershon home on Fairhope Avenue, and we know the Gaston home on Magnolia. So they moved. It might have been one or the other location, but Summit? What's on?
Well, that's where Piney
Oh, yeah, yes, Piney and Jim, but it could have been one. It doesn't look like Summit. But there wasn't anything there, so who knows? Let me see. This is just sort of a typical Fairhope house of those early days. Nothing that special. All I know, it said on the caption of this picture, Flemming House, and they spelled it F-L-E-M-M-I-N-G. I think that may have been a misspelling, but you know, because there were some Flemings. Flemings lived here, F-L-E-M-I-N-G. But does anybody know that house or who
It
the?
looks vaguely similar in shape to Nancy Calhoun's house.
Could be. Which is no longer there.
Yes, exactly. The corner of Magnolia and Summit Street.
I don't think it is that, but I don't know.
Well,
They would have taken that porch off, is what you're thinking, right? I can't really remember what that house looked like.
Well, it had been added on to like so many.
Yeah. Now, I want to get to some Fairhope people. I hope we all know who this is. Even as the single tax colony struggled to popularize Henry George's single tax theory and E.V. Gaston's cooperative individualism, Marietta Johnson had already put Fairhope on the map by 1916 with her radical educational reformist ideas. John Dewey visited Fairhope to review the School of Organic Education in 1913, and he was most impressed, writing a glowing report on the school, which was widely read in educational circles around the country. After this, and because of Mrs. Johnson's many speaking tours around the country and on education panels around the world, families moved to Fairhope to enroll their children in the school. Isn't that a wonderful picture? I think that one goes back before 1916, but it's a very, I think this is a real treasure. And I'm sure it's on the same spot that the Fairhope Pharmacy now stands. Here's the interior of the Fairhope Pharmacy, and it couldn't have been that same building. It's Nathaniel Mashon, I'm pretty sure, sitting back there, overseeing the whole scene. He was the pharmacist. And here's Fairhope Avenue, kind of as we remember it. This is probably in the 30s, I guess. Those cars look like 1930s. But you have the Fairhope Pharmacy on the corner, and next to it was the Bank of Fairhope, and next to that was the Soda Garden, which was a little cafe and soda shop that pretty much catered to the high school crowd. It was a mob scene after school every afternoon, and it was wonderful. The Pine Quat shop was run by Mr. Call's wife and his daughter. And Pine Quat was a product that they sold there, which there's no such thing as a pine quat, but there is a kumquat, and they made kumquat jam, and they put it up in little jars and covered the jars in baskets made of pine straw. And that was what a pine quat was. They sold a lot of novelties there, little gifts and handmade things. A lot of the early Fairhope people were very good at crafts, and I think they were sold at this place too. That's on Fairhope Avenue. There's a bank there now. It's across from the pharmacy, basically. And it stood, I think it was there for 60 years. 62 years is what I wrote. Okay, just up the block, we have what it says here, the world famous organic school. And it was world famous in those days. The building in the foreground was Cummings Hall, named for Lydia Cummings, one of Mrs. Johnson's wonderful best friends, who helped fund her starting of the school for years and helped her with the school. It was a community center as much as anything for the school. It was used for lectures and for meetings, club meetings, and it had a nice stage, and it was used for theatrical events and all kind of parties and festivals at the school. That picture, you can't really see much of the rest of the campus, but it's across the street from here. It's now the scene of Faulkner, and not much of it looks the same. That building is about where the administration building of Faulkner is, but it's closer to Fairhope Avenue. This is the interior of Cummings Hall. And this is a very fascinating picture to me. It had to have been taken from the stage, don't you think? And you're looking out toward to the entrance of the hall. Obviously, this is some very important personage who was making a speech or something. The thing was labeled 1928, but I'm pretty sure that was earlier. When I see those hats on those women, I just think it was probably in the 19-teens. But that's a building that's very much missed. It was a wonderful place for this kind of an event. And it was used all the time. This is the earliest picture of the organic school students. And it says it's circa 1910. I think that's about right. All those children are numbered, but that was for identification, and we have most of their names on the back. The one on the far right, standing very solemnly, is Clifford Ernest Johnson. He was Mrs. Johnson's son. And there's a strong family resemblance. He was a very serious kid, obviously. And there is two people are not identified. They're names for almost all of them, but the two little boys in the center, number 4 and number 10, are not identified. And I suspect that number 10 is David Sinclair, the son of Upton Sinclair. He was, Upton Sinclair lived in Fairhope for about a year or so, and they did enroll their son in the school, and it would have been that year. Raymond Dyson is in this picture. I'm not sure which one he is. But anyway, I don't have the list of names, and we wouldn't know many of them anyway. Those are the two teachers in the back. This is a picture of David Sinclair with his dad, Upton Sinclair, years before. It wasn't in Fairhope, but I think his mama cut his hair. I think it might have been the same child, but it's just conjecture. This is the famous photograph of Marietta Johnson. It was taken by John Dewey's daughter when he came to report on the school. One thing that interests me about that building behind them, the Bell Building, already looked a little bit shabby. Look at those columns. Paint was peeling off of it. And also, what I always love is that little girl was barefooted in the center. But Mrs. Johnson is earnestly teaching a class out of doors, which was radical in those days. And it was very important in her theory of education that the children should be out of doors as much as possible. This picture was also the model for the statue of Mrs. Johnson that's on the bluff. This is my favorite picture of the organic school. I think there's probably teachers. There could be some students up there too, but they're building one of the buildings for the school, and to me it just typifies what that school was all about, particularly in those days. And in fact, that young lady on the ladder sort of inspired me for my character Amelia in the book, who I'm impressed that the women were building the building. And there they are in those long dresses, climbing on ladders and building the building. It's just extraordinary to me.
Well, Lois, I'm sure everybody pitched in, but my father commented frequently about student labor and how the students build things, in particular Cummings Hall. There's a good bit of student labor going into Cummings Hall.
Yes, and I use that in my book. My book takes place in 1920, and the Amelia character is just visiting the school, and she has her interview with Mrs. Johnson, and as she's walking onto the campus, she sees them building this building, which is Cummings Hall. And she walks in and engages in conversation with the kids that are building it, and she sees that they are being taught, and they're building their own building. So I just think this is a very special thing to have for our historical collection. This is just getting away from the school. There were a lot of extraordinary buildings in town, and this is one that is very much missed. It was the Colonial Inn. The building, there's a vacant lot where that building was. Now, it overlooks the bay. It's on the corner of Mobile Street and Cliff Drive. That's another view of it. It was a wonderful hostelry. It was used in town for, well, when many of the prestigious visitors who came stayed there, but it was also had a lovely restaurant, and it was a site for wedding receptions and that sort of thing. This was another building in town that is very historical. I think it was the first church that went up. It was the Christian church, which stood sort of where not where the K1 Center is, but on that corner of St. James and Church Street. So I guess it was the Church of Church Street. And the Gaston family were charter members, and the Merchant family, and almost everybody in early Fairhope. This is the library as it was remodeled. It is now the University of South Alabama owns the building. It's been remodeled much since then. But that's the library we remember going to. That's the early public school, and that's a better shot of it. And it stands where the Kitty Park is. I still miss this building, even though it was pretty shabby by the time I knew it. This is a wonderful building in Fairhope. It's still there, but it doesn't look anything like that anymore. It was originally, I think it was a women's club, maybe Mobile Women's Club or something like that, and they would use it as a retreat. My mother lived in Mobile, and as a teenager, say in the 1920s, she came to a church retreat, and they stayed in that building, and she always cherished her memories of sleeping on those sleeping porches. Here's another shot of it. You're looking at it in the distance. The building in the foreground, there's a restaurant called La Corona, and I think that was still there when we moved here in 1949, but it wasn't there much longer. It was a very popular restaurant. And there were Gulleys. When you remember Old Fairhope, the Gulleys played a huge part in people's lives. And it's hard to know exactly why that was and how that was and why it's not that way anymore. We had to fill most of them in. But people, grown-ups and children, would climb down those bluffs and walk through the gullies. There's another view of the gully. There was more to Fairhope than the serene retreat and philosophical theories it exemplified in those days. In 1916, war was raging in Europe, and there was political unrest this side of the ocean. Women were fighting for the right to vote. In Fairhope, the right for women to vote had been a given since 1895. The women were always allowed to vote in colony elections from the first. On July 4th, 1916, Fairhope had its annual parade. This is from the Mobile parade of that year. And I love this picture. It really captures the spirit of people enjoying the 4th. It's quite a flag they've got. And it definitely, you can tell that it's 1916. What these people didn't know is what they were in for on July 5th, 1916. One of the most devastating hurricanes that ever hit this part of the country came on July 5th, unannounced. It was the days before they really had the kind of meteorological forecast that we do today. No TV guys standing there in front of the cone of uncertainty. Nobody knew there was going to be a hurricane, and it destroyed so many things. It destroyed the bay boats, and it took quite a while to rebuild after this. I was going to say that hurricanes in those days didn't have categories, so we don't know whether it was a Category 1 or a Category 5, and they didn't have names. All we know is the hurricane of 1916, and it was a bad one. Settlements and cities cleaned up and rebuilt. The Great War showed no signs of abating. German agents actually attacked a munitions factory in Jersey City, New Jersey, killing 7. On November 7th, 1916, Woodrow Wilson was reelected in a close race, and Jeanette Rankin was the first woman to be elected to Congress. She was one of 50 members of Congress who voted against involvement in U.S. involvement in World War I. And she was all her life in politics and was always an anti-war candidate. She was one of the only people, she was the only member who voted against declaring war on Japan following the attack on Pearl Harbor. And she said, "My constituents vote me into office to vote against war, and I would never be comfortable voting for war because they don't expect that of me." Fairhope, 100 years ago, was isolated, quiet, and bustling with the energy of newborn ideas and the possibility that it was truly changing the world. The world did change, but not in the way those early Fairhope settlers could have imagined. Political leaders were not ready for the kind of utopia Fairhope was. And although over time it has prospered, it has, unfortunately some might say, changed with the times. Thank you.